Emerging technologies both challenge and reward the financial services industry. With the advent of the Internet of Things, we've seen the development of new technologies, innovative applications, creative ways to solve problems, and the emergence of new opportunities that demand our attention. We've developed context-rich systems to respond to the new environment, adapting our use of analytics and intelligence. Innovations such as virtual currency may become some of the biggest disruptors in the history of IT. It's time to ask some big questions. How will this adaptive, smart approach affect the decision-making process? Our customers demand an always-on relationship. How do we meet their needs and provide continuous availability? How will we identify our customers? How will our customers identify us? Can we create an indisputable digital identity? How do we get ahead of ever more sophisticated cyber threats? Can we become more efficient by joining forces? How long can we hide inside the castle walls? It's time to find some big answers.
Good morning. I'm Murray Walton. I'm Chief Risk Officer of Fiserv, a U.S. financial processor, and it will be my pleasure to moderate our session this morning. Stability, continuity, and integrity have always been the hallmarks of the financial services industry, and security is a very explicit promise that we make to our stakeholders because we're caretakers and facilitators of the world's financial affairs. So over the course of my career, and I am an old guy, but over the course of that career, the constellation of risks that faced my predecessors have fallen by the wayside, and they've been replaced by technology-driven risks that are emerging at the speed of life. Where once risk management and technology were somewhat separate disciplines, and once upon a time focused on such arcane things as securing the building and credit risk and perhaps risk of employee misbehavior, today technology-driven risks dominate, have taken center stage. That's true for our IT and our risk management staffs. It's true for our auditors and our regulators. And it's also very true in our executive suites and boardrooms. This panel today will seek to demystify and illuminate the current crop of cyber risks as we understand them. We will, with your help in some interactive panels, attempt to define our readiness as an ecosystem and suggest perhaps some best practices or some effective risk management practices. And finally, we are going to emphasize, per the title of the session, we are going to emphasize the virtues and value of community, that our collective wisdom and strength is what's needed in this very connected world, in this era of cyber risk. So with that, I would like our panelists to introduce themselves, and each will comment briefly on his view of the leading cyber risk that commands his attention today. Beginning is Mark Clancy.
Thank you. So my name is Mark Clancy. I'm the Chief Executive of Soltra. It's a joint venture between DTCC and the Financial Services Information Share and Analysis Center. And my main issue is how do we get from the awareness of a threat to a decision and action very quickly?
Good morning, I'm Madan Oberoi. I'm Director Cyber Innovation and Outreach at Interpol, which is providing law enforcement agencies in our 190 member countries strategy, research, training, and operational support. And in my view, the biggest challenge which we are facing is to find a way to integrate the territorial-based responses to this global challenge.
Good morning, I'm Paul O'Rourke. I lead EY's Asia Pacific Cyber Risk and Cybersecurity Division. For me, the key issue is oversight, governance and transparency. Whatever the risks are, Internet of Things, other threats that are here today, they'll change tomorrow. And I think the key issue we need to face into as an industry and as a collective is the response model and the awareness, and it properly framed by executives around support and around funding, I think it provides a framework to actually address those risks.
Good morning. My name is Koen Voormeulen, Director Cash and Payment Systems in the Central Bank of the Netherlands. And for this panel, maybe more important, I'm a co-chair of CPMI IOSCO International Working Group on Cyber Resilience. The main risk that I see, actually I want to talk about a little bit later, because I saw your polling questions, Murray, and that fits best. But the second main risk, I would say, is that FMIs, when they are dealing with cyber risks, they have a lot to do. But actually what is more important, that the financial markets and the financial market infrastructures and banks together try to solve cyber risks as an ecosystem. And that concerted action, that's very difficult once you are in trouble, because there's more enough to do for an institution on its own.
Thank you. To round out the introductions, I've been Chief Risk Officer at Pfizer for the past 10 years. Previous was a senior executive of a bank for 15 and a practicing attorney before that. I am an economist and lawyer by training, and yet across my career I've become a very enthusiastic technologist, because you can't be in this world without that credential and without that motivating interest. My view, by the way, of the greatest risk right now facing us all is talent. That as capable as every one of us may be in this room, the talent pipeline requires constant development to ensure that our successors will be even smarter and greater in number than we. So at this juncture, we are going to begin with our first polling question. We have arbitrarily, let's see, I'll wait for this to pop up. All right. So the connector at your seat is your vehicle for input into the poll. And so when prompted, you will press the numbers on the pad that correspond to the answers you wish to give. If you do wish to change your mind, I've done that once or twice, the red triangle is your back button. And remember to press the green button to submit and be counted. Pressing the green button makes the whole exercise worthwhile. All right. So our first polling question is essentially looking at the threat landscape. We've arbitrarily determined that there are really 4 dimensions to cyber risk, to the cyber threat. There is a threat, number 1, to the availability of systems, the systems that we use both internally and to serve customers. Number 2, there is the constant threat of financial fraud, account hijacking, and similar actions. The third choice is the risk posed, or the threat of data exposure. And the final is the risk of information integrity, widespread data disruption. So we would ask you at this point to vote, please, and tell us which one of these strikes you as your biggest concern for the coming year. And while you're voting, you'll see a little information access or exposure by a wide margin. I feel like I'm announcing a horse race. All right. Well, this panel, of course, is brimming with expertise in this space, and I'd like to turn first to Mark Clancy to comment on his general views about the threat landscape.
So a few things. From the poll, it seems like most people are interested in information access. And I think that's an important issue because it's been very public and very visible, and our clients are dealing with it. We've been dealing with our institution. But I would like to highlight that some of the other categories are where I see the emerging threats coming. There have been destructive attacks that have attacked financial infrastructures, attacked entertainment companies, those perhaps who produce movies that other politicians didn't like. And I think that piece, and Cohen will go to this when he talks about resiliency, I think that notion of it's not just a single problem. There are hacktivists who want to express their political point. There are nation states who are furthering their national agenda. There are parties who are actually trying to disrupt or disable the function of the financial system. And oh, by the way, there's a plethora of criminals who are trying to steal any way they can. And as we look at this risk, we have to recognize we have multiple hazards that we have to simultaneously deal with. And each company in the room has a different mix of those four groups that they need to address.
Cohen, how do these threats translate into actual risks for our industry?
Yes, of course, if you look at banks or financial market infrastructures, they are not operating on themselves, but they are part of a payments chain or a securities chain. And obviously, if, for instance, an institution transfers the wrong amounts to the wrong counterparties, then a financial stability issue can be at stake. This can be easily about billions of dollars. And then if these wrong amounts are transferred to wrong parties, then knock-on effects can happen. A bank expects to get money, but it doesn't have money, so it cannot pay what it needs to pay, and so on. These knock-on effects are very dangerous for the financial system, and that's why if you look, for instance, to financial market infrastructures, the authorities have written down in the so-called principles for financial market infrastructures that institutions need to be able to recover from a successful incident within 2 hours. That's a challenging task, but it's important because if institutions cannot do that, then also the risk is there that at the end of the day, literally at the end of a day, a 24-hour day, transactions cannot be settled. And if that happens, then again, financial stability is on the table. And that's how it works. Cyber risks have financial stability risks.
Indeed. Paul, do you think that array of voting that we saw would be different if we were looking at a different industry? Did anything about that surprise you?
No, probably reinforced what I believe is the issue in the industry. There's really three types of impact around cyber risk. You've got transactional impact, you've got regulatory impact, and you've got reputational impact. And if you look at access, it's primarily a reputational impact. And reputational has a number of things. It's exposure in the newspapers right through to share price impacts and triage costs. So if translating across industries, it's fairly standard and all industries are very similar. The one that's probably stands out that is obviously financial services related is the financial fraud. So most industries are primarily focused around reputational risk and to a lesser degree transactional risk and probably third regulatory. Financial services turns it around the other way and most banks primarily concerned around reputational, regulatory and transactional, with transactional being a key issue around financial fraud, but definitely not the top issue.
Okay. Madan, what is Interpol and law enforcement generally seeing in terms of trends across these categories of threats? And what projections, if any, seem reasonable from the current data?
Well, let me answer the second part first regarding the volumes. We believe that we don't have an accurate assessment of either the cost or the quantum of these attacks or cybercrimes because whatever figures we normally see, they are either based on a limited subscriber base or a limited experience or maybe a limited reporting in our jurisdiction. So we don't have a more accurate assessment and so I won't comment on the volume part. But as far as the trends are concerned, in addition to the 4 categories which were listed, what we are also witnessing is a new way of extortion by threatening any of these in terms of extortion by threatening non-availability or denial of service kind of thing. So these are the trends which are catching up in terms of the criminal activities in this area.
Okay. So the landscape as we see it is one where clearly there are motivated threat actors, and some of them have financial goals, some of them have ideological goals. But in any event, their desire is to be inside of our systems, to exfiltrate or to extract data that we possess. And I think the ultimate worst case that we fear right now is a destabilization financially. And our panel, I think, would coalesce around that all of this threat landscape comes down to one thing. We are where the money is. And if money does not move in the correct amount, at the correct time, to the correct place, trust in our financial services industry is compromised. And that is the outcome, of course, we seek to avoid. Again, security is that explicit promise we have always made. So let's turn to a second poll question. This one is a little bit more complicated, and I'll explain it in a little greater detail than some of you may actually need. But we look at these 5 dimensions: governance, executive leadership, strategic focus, resource levels, and awareness levels as being dimensions of maturity in your organization and mine. We are all probably at different levels of maturity across these 5 domains. And so what we would ask you to do, as you'll see in the box at the right on the screen, is to rank these. Your area of greatest maturity should be first, your area of second, best maturity second, and so on. And given that this may require a bit of thinking and sorting, this one we give you a bit longer, but you may begin voting now on this one. Very interesting, very interesting. Madan, what is your reaction to these numbers? Are these surprising to you?
No, I would say I'm rather pleasantly surprised because normally awareness is not rated very high, and this leads to sometimes either overestimation or underestimation of risk. But probably in light of the more newer disruptive technologies and risks which are coming, probably awareness is one issue which needs to be addressed foremost.
We contend in my organization that educated people make better decisions. So this is actually heartening, I think, for us as a whole, because if we do have aware associate populations, that is, they are our front lines after all. Interesting that governance actually came in at the second post. Again, my board of directors is intensely concerned, sometimes to my gross irritation actually, but my board of directors is very concerned about cybersecurity, and I wondered if we were an anomaly or not. Apparently not. So, Mark, looking at resources and executive leadership engagement, what are some of the techniques that you would suggest for organizations that are seeking to advance their level of maturity, particularly in those areas that scored lower?
So maybe a little humorously, go ask your board to start a business in this space. It gets a lot of engagement. No, on a more serious tone, I think the resource side, you mentioned talent earlier. I think one of the great challenges we have in this space is there's a huge deficit of experts in this area who are what I call bilingual. They have to speak the language of technology and they have to speak the language of business. Mm-hmm. And translating these risks into things that are understandable to people who are not technology practitioners is sort of one of the hard skills. I also kind of say the challenge in this space is this is a risk that we don't know how to price right now. And so you're using a lot of metaphors and examples of how to describe a problem because people don't have that inherent modeling and understanding of how to calculate what the exposures are, mainly because the field keeps evolving. I kind of say, in physical threats, we worry about weather events. This is a field where we invent new weather every week.
Yes, indeed. Indeed. Changing at the speed of life. Indeed. Yeah. Cohen, same question. What advice would you have to organizations looking to increase their level of executive engagement and perhaps the resource commitments as well?
Well, actually, I think a lot can be done in institutions. Maybe I can mention 3 points. I think it is very useful for financial institutions to enhance their threat intelligence level to make sure that that you know as an institution where you are in the threat landscape and to what kind of threats you need to prepare most. I think that's something that also on board level can get a bit more attention. I think the second one is testing. Testing is, everybody knows that, everybody does it, but I think that should be enhanced substantially, and also, if possible, sector-wide testing, because that brings in new items, things that normally you would assume are there, may not be there when you test on a broader scale. In England, for instance, the Bank of England engages now in testing in the so-called CBEST initiative, where that's red teaming tests are done in the financial sector. We in the Netherlands are embarking upon the same now. And I would say the third and maybe most important and most difficult thing is to try to think out of the box when it comes to how to recover again from integrity attacks. When your system is corrupted, how can you make sure that you can resume your operations quickly and safely? That's difficult. When we talk to institutions, they say, well, maybe I mentioned this 2-hour recovery time objective that are in the principles. Institutions say, well, maybe we need even more than 2 hours to find out what at all is the issue, and let alone before we can fix it. But if that is the answer, then also extending this to 3 hours won't help, to 2 days will not help. So the question is, what should you do then? And maybe the answer is, well, if your system is corrupted and you cannot resume in that system within 2 hours, maybe you should resume in another system in 2 hours. That's let's say, a kind of solution which is slightly out of the box. There are solutions for it, but institutions consider that a headache, I would say. And but I would also say, well, after 9/11 in the US, for instance, when the authorities put on the table, hey, we need operational centers on a bigger distance from each other, fully operational, that was considered impossible at that time, but it's now a normal practice. So maybe this also, when we move towards setups where you can resume your operations in a different system than the one that's attacked, maybe that's a good practice for the future. Okay. So that's something that needs thought, I would say, in the board and in the technical fields of the organization.
Well, indeed, continuity planning has switched from essentially worrying about fire, floods, and winds to worrying about cyber defense. And so resilience has taken on a very different character than it had for a prior generation of bankers. When I was a baby banker, but within 1 month of employment, I had to deal with a massive fire that destroyed a headquarters building. Yeah. Different day. That organization's continuity plans today make basically no mention of the fire hazard. I believe they figure they had their turn at that. But on the other hand, extraordinary preparedness for cyber. So it's interesting how the ecosystem has adapted some. Paul, would you talk about some of the common mistakes that organizations make on their path to greater maturity, and talk a little bit too about forensic resources. What do you understand about what organizations may have in-house today versus hired on the spot?
It's a good question. I think the biggest issue around maturity is not knowing end state. And interestingly, governance has come out as one of the top issues. What I hear almost every week is benchmark. Organisations and boards particularly looking at a benchmark and the relative position against peers. And it's safe to say in cyber, you don't need to be best in class against your peers. You certainly can't be worst in class against your peers. But the problem statement for a lot of organisations is they don't know the future state. They don't know where they want to land, and they focus too much on a relative benchmark today, and that is how we benchmarked against our peers, what are our exposures, what's our roadmap, and what do we need to do. The more forward-thinking organisations take it to a different view and say, looking at financial services, looking at the whole change in the fintech and the whole nature of payment systems, looking at the whole disruptive view of technology, and looking at the whole cyber threat landscape, and taking the three of them, looking at a forward state maturity, and as an example saying, by 2019, this is what our cyber risk function should look like in-house, and then backtracking from there, rather than just saying today, where we are today and what's a relative benchmark, is trying to design a future state function. And to the second part of the problem statement, too many focus just on cyber. Cyber is a byproduct of the technology landscape changes, of the, as I said before, the changes in the whole financial services and payments. So all three need to be incorporated in what is the future state organisation going to look like, and then what's a future state operating model, and then based off that, what's our relative benchmark. To the second part of the question around forensics, I think it comes back to the key point made before. There's an absolute shortage of skills in the market. And to the other point made, that there's a lot of people understand cyber security. There's not too many understand cyber risk. And one of the biggest issues I see in organisations, particularly in the forensic space, is converting what do these cybersecurity vulnerabilities fundamentally mean to risks and mean to then impact on an organisation. And one of the problems with cyber, and probably the ultimate problem for boards, is it's been a qualitative problem forever. And that is, it might happen, this is a risk position, but if it does happen, we can't quantify the impact. Some of the new methods around quantitative modelling on cyber is probably the best advancements I've seen in the last 12 months. And that's taking a lot of the empirical data from breaches that have happened in the last 5 years, looking at the whole maturity in an organisation, and helping a board and say, based on your risk position, if you have a cyber breach, this is the quantitative impact on your organisation within a range. And what that means is your share price is likely to be impacted by X to Y. You're likely to have to face regulatory sanctions of a certain amount, and your triage costs are within a range of X. It allows a much more empirical view of risk management. It's what boards are most used to in terms of other types of risk management, and executives. They've just never had that data in the past around cyber.
Indeed. So we began by talking about the threat landscape and decided that ultimately the risk of financial fraud, perhaps on a very large scale, is what keeps us awake at night. We then segued into this discussion of how we're positioned today. And I think it's interesting. We have the benefit of being able to see the poll results, and perhaps, I don't know if we can go back to them there, but it's interesting, excellent, that it's actually very promising to hear how widespread awareness is within our organizations. That's an area where we feel like we're fairly mature. And it's also good to know that there is governance enrollment behind this. I think the thing that troubles me most as member of an executive leadership team is seeing that comes in relatively wanting compared to the board position on this. And as we've discussed, the quest for maturity is a very individual one. Every organization has its own talent quotient, has its own market and product array, its own technology stacks, and so forth. But in the end, we are positioned it seems to me relatively confident that we've integrated cybersecurity into our business strategies, and we are poised to manage the risks ahead. The next section is actually the purpose of this session, and that is to talk about joining forces on cybersecurity. In fact, in my father's day and my grandfather's day, and they were both august bankers in their own right, but their banks were islands, and they simply managed their affairs quite independently, perhaps circumspectly. Perhaps they didn't share very much because they were afraid of what a competitor might make of that information. But clearly, technology risk has revolutionized that. Because we are all connected now, we cannot pretend that we are still on islands. And so the next section will be, if you will, the punchline of the session about joining forces on cybersecurity. So if we could move to our third poll, please. So we're going to talk here about a hypothetical breach. The hypothetical breach we describe is that some customer names and customer email addresses have been extracted for a very small slice of your organization, nothing more. There's been no password, no account number, simply a name and an email address for a relatively small slice of your organization. So this one gets to incident management and how broadly you engage and what your circle of trust looks like in the event of this kind of relatively benign breach. So what we would ask you to do is use your voting unit to indicate which of the 6, and it may be all 6 or it may be any number less than that, you would involve in awareness and management of the incident described. So please vote. Interesting, truly interesting. So executive level management would definitely be informed. My company was once a holding company, and we had dozens of business units, and some of them did not recognize an obligation. They didn't really know we owned them, I guess. And so my own organization, perhaps 10 years ago, we would have scored rather poorly on that top bar. Today, we would score off the chart. But you would notify the customers, or at least the preponderance, 2/3 would notify the customers involved. Regulators involved in just over half. That's interesting. Law enforcement, less. An external forensics or security advisor, about 1/3 of you would involve that sort of advisor, and only 20% would involve industry peers or a consortium like the Information Sharing and Analysis Center. So, panel, Madan, what value comes from involving law enforcement, and how is that different than involving a regulator? Do the two play well together? Do they have complementary roles? How are they different?
Before answering that, let me give you some statistics about what we faced in India. I come from Indian Police Service, and we found that out of the fraction of incidents which were reported to CERT, the Computer Emergency Response Team, which again itself was a fraction of total incidents happening, only 10% of those, less than 10% of those were reported to law enforcement. So 42% is a very encouraging figure to me. And the reason for less reporting to law enforcement probably lies in the question you are asking. What value does it bring in terms of reporting to law enforcement? And this is what most victims think about. If I report to law enforcement, how will it help? And because probably they don't see any value in reporting to law enforcement, because probably our track record in terms of bringing people to justice in this has not been very encouraging. But in terms of value, probably we'll have to look at the physical world, and where we are seeing presently in cyber that most of the approaches are focusing on building more protections or building more security features and hoping that this will probably prevent more attacks. But our experience from physical world is that putting more locks does not reduce the crime. And the only deterrence is a successful prosecution. And the first step to prosecution is reporting promptly to the law enforcement. So unless we report that, this may not be a very healthy trend. And secondly, I'll use this opportunity to point out another trend which is happening, which is true for law enforcement also, is in terms of disruptions rather than prosecution. Even in law enforcement these days, we hear more in terms of number of takedowns rather than number of arrests, and which can be a short-term strategy, but probably not a very good long-term strategy, because here we are assuming the role of prosecutor, judge, as well as investigator. So maybe we have to see that in a criminal justice system, unless we involve law enforcement from day one, the chances of attributing it to the right criminal are reduced, and without actually bringing consequences on criminal, we are not creating a deterrence.
Indeed. Perhaps a peculiarly US experience, although I'd be relieved to learn that it's global. Sometimes we are reluctant to involve law enforcement because law enforcement itself is multi-agency, multi-jurisdictional, and we end up being in the middle of what is for us an unproductive battle among agencies for jurisdiction. And that has sometimes complicated, it certainly has eroded our confidence in law enforcement as an ally in this fight. And yet, we do also recognize that without that ultimate prosecution or that threat of prosecution, we're somewhat limited, but it requires us to play games, at least in the US, with which agency and which division of which agency we may bring into the party. So, Paul, could you talk a bit about external forensics and security advisors? Many of our organizations, of course, have our own internal groups, but as you can see, in at least a third of cases, even for an incident that's relatively benign, like this one, there would be involvement from an external forensics and security advisor. Could you talk about the role and the role vis-a-vis the internal and how the two complement each other?
Yeah, I think one of the key values is resource expertise and resource availability. It's increasingly hard, and we've touched on before around skills shortages. It's increasingly hard to maintain the capability in-house around very specific forensics and investigative capabilities. I think that's probably the key benefit it adds to most organisations. Ability to tap into the right resources at the right time. For most internal organisations, increasingly hard to hire, if not retain, a lot of specialist resources in these areas. But on the flip side as well, when external parties come in, they need to be well integrated. And an interesting second level question for me would be, from the executive level management, would they call in the external providers? Because I think that's the complexity we get. And I think if the security function calls in the external reviewers, forensic or security function, there's a good cooperative model. But where in a regulator or the executive level management calls in the external party, it can actually result in friction. And I think that's one issue that needs a bit of focus in some organisations, and that's how best to manage with third parties to make sure that the messaging going up in the organisation is consistent and it's well coordinated.
In the case of when you are retained for an engagement like this, is it helpful to have a prior relationship, or can you come in cold and add value? Is there a point to us, the collective us, reaching out and and creating that relationship with an external advisor in advance?
Yeah, absolutely. I think coming in cold, the one thing you might know is the technology, the expertise, the capability. You don't understand the organisation. You don't understand it both from a structural view and very much from a political view. And if there's one thing that these results tell us is that cyber is a political issue as well in organisations. And so I think it needs to be appropriately managed. So the better that an external party knows the organisation, knows the areas that they need to talk to. In the past, it was primarily the technology area. These days, it's risk, it's legal, it's business executives, it's right through the organisation, and understanding the political map and really who and how the operating model should work is really critical.
Okay. Mark, what are some of the industry-level structures that have been created? What has been the track record? And what are some of the obstacles or challenges that industry collaboration faces?
Sure. So let me start with the survey. I think number 6 is the reason why these events are on the front page of the newspaper. It's because the bad guys are getting tremendous reuse and leverage because we're not telling each other what's happening. And I will also say, and I'll get to your question through this, that every major incident for the last 24 to 30 months that you read about in the newspaper that happened in the financial sector, the institutions were sharing information about the attack before it was a public event, every single one. And the way they were doing that was through the FSISAC, and one of the attributes of the FSISAC, it has 2 parts. It has a confidentiality agreement between the players about disclosure, and also allows for anonymous reporting. So you don't have to say, oops, this was my bad thing, it happened. You can say, hey, I'm seeing this weird thing, you should be aware of it. And what has happened in all those cases is other parties have said, hey, I saw this, I think it's related. And the original reporter who was investigating the incident now learned more about what's happening in their own institution because lo and behold, the same thing was happening elsewhere. Perhaps the best example of this is when the US financial sector came under attack for denial of service attacks. And there was a systematic campaign about 2 years ago where one institution after another was getting flooded with traffic. Literally, Tuesday it's firm 1, Wednesday it's firm 2, Thursday it's firm 3. And the first 2 times the attackers had tremendous success. But as they went through their campaign, we created this additional sharing circle that shared real-time information about what was happening with, actually in this case, full attribution. And by the time the 3rd or 4th attack happened, it was less effective. And eventually the sharing was so effective, the attackers moved on and went and did something else. So there are examples where this has worked, but I think we have a lot of work to do to get that understanding and that pervasiveness within the management team within a company, not just the practitioners who fight these threats every day.
And if I can just add to that, probably something that brings it home around it being a collective problem is the reports in the press over the last day around Anonymous announcing that October is a month of attacking financial services companies globally. And I think that really brings it home that it is a collective problem, and more there needs to be a collective response from the sector.
Koen, could you please address the regulatory side of this?
Let me first make one remark on the poll. You framed it as a minor incident, if I may call it like that. I would be curious whether the answers would be different with a bigger incident. But let's suppose it's more or less the same, then number 6 is a bit worrying, actually. And what Mark said, I fully support that I think in practice this is a bit better. And also very important, in the US, DDoS attacks happened in the Netherlands as well. And it's very important that if, for instance, even a relatively small DDoS attack takes place, that industry peers are informed because they might be the next target. And that brings with it that the industry sees cyber attacks not as a competitive issue. Let's say, oh, I'm better protected in cyber terms than my competitor, so that's good for me. No, I think any attack is bad for the whole industry. So I think that is important to bear in mind and to hopefully get over hesitation to inform peers. And I think the FSISAC, which is mentioned here, has a bit better track record than this poll shows. But your question regarding the regulators, partly it's the same issue. You know, once even a relatively small incident can have a follow-up in other companies. So if regulators are informed on time, then, for instance, let's say crisis management structures can be activated. In the Netherlands, for instance, we have such a system where we agree with banks and financial institutions that they inform us, even if it's small accidents, and if it stays small, then we simply do nothing with it. But as soon as we might think that it can have a spillover, then we inform the whole sector, at least at a certain level, and then we can act collectively. So that's one reason to inform the regulators. The second is if the issue is bigger, okay, this was a small issue, but if the issue is bigger, then of course what can happen is that banks or financial market infrastructures get into these knock-on effects, which was discussed earlier. And then central banks or regulators might have to embark upon crisis measures, extending liquidity, for instance, to institutions which need liquidity, but through a cyber incident, they don't get what they normally would get in terms of money. So also for that, to prevent that it will be really a financial stability problem, regulators should be informed. And well, I'm relatively happy with the score in this. I thought the regulators would be a bit lower, but apparently people see that it is of some use to inform them.
Well, the delta between regulators and law enforcement was interesting to me. I tend to think that once I've notified a regulator of an issue, that law enforcement will find out about it some way. Mm-hmm. So the significant delta here. So yeah. Let me ask the panel just for some comment. If this had been a different type of incident, and let's say specifically that this time we're talking about an incident where significant official systems of record data compromised, and so that the bank or the firm opens on Monday morning and there is simply the records are simply unreliable. What changes? What do you think would be the difference in emphasis? Would law enforcement be more likely to be consulted?
No, I would say that external forensics and security advisor will move up above the law enforcement, because if it is a minor thing, and external forensics would bring a cost to that. So that's why it is being brought at a lower level. The moment you make it a big impact thing, probably law enforcement in the present day circumstances goes down.
Okay. Other thoughts?
Yeah, maybe. I think there can be a natural tension between law enforcement or forensics compared to financial stability. I can imagine that from a law enforcement perspective, there should be as least as possible openness, because as soon as everything is out in the open, then it's more difficult to, let's say, to find the criminals. Whereas from a financial stability point of view, the openness might be crucial to have all the connected parties informed on time so that they can take measures to prevent things becoming worse. So here's a natural tension. I think that should be solved by regular contacts between regulators and law enforcement before incidents happen, so that they know each other and know how to connect to each other and make proper priorities.
So as we've discussed these various constituencies, and these are all tools that one might have at one's disposal in the event of an incident, which are most likely to be useful to the institution? So if my institution suffered some sort of an escapade where financial fraud had been committed, and what would a regulator be able to do for me? As I recognize an obligation to report to a regulator, but what could the regulator do for me?
So I can give a U.S.-centric answer. So one of the processes put in place in the United States was through the regulator the ability to request technical assistance from the government. So experts in Homeland Security or the National Security Agency or wherever they're needed in the U.S. government. So the Department of the Treasury has that power, and when a regulator, whether it's the Fed or the SEC or one of the other regulators goes to them, they can bring those resources to bear. So in a significant incident, that's definitely something you want to be able to use. I don't think they would map to the external forensic security advisor item, but that's definitely something that other countries should look at. Do they have that kind of model where they can use the sovereign regulators to bring those national resources to bear if it really is a significant issue?
So regulator as a source of expertise. Law enforcement, same?
And I would slightly differ from the framing of the question. It is not which one. I think all stakeholders have to be involved. And I would point to the model which is being followed in Pittsburgh in NCFTA, where we are seeing National Cyber Forensic and Training Alliance, where we are seeing representatives from all stakeholders working jointly in one space and sharing things informally, even before the incident happens, and that probably addresses the issue of financial stability versus attribution and identification of criminal. So maybe these are the kinds of models which we have to look into to address this new kind of situation which is developing in cyber domain.
Okay, a motivator for joining forces.
Just on that, I think the higher the regulator goes in the mapping, the two that will probably move with it are the external providers and the executive management. Because increasingly to report to regulators, there's a view internally in a lot of organisations, we need to have a very clear story. We need to show evidence and what we're doing around the investigative process and triage and remediation. And as part of that as well, communicating the same to executive level management before it goes to regulators.
Okay. So I think we have made the point that it takes a village. In the contemporary environment, it takes a village to solve this challenge, to address this challenge adequately. That there are things we can do for ourselves, certainly, and that's always been the case, I think. But that there is increasingly perhaps a role of regulators and law enforcement in providing specialized expertise and insight. There's a role from industry organizations and peers in sharing information and aggregating information about that threat landscape to allow us, those of us who are presently sitting untouched, to be prepared for what may be ahead. So joining forces is good. Perspectives from the audience. Are there aspects of the threat landscape or our current maturity position or prospects for joining forces that you would like us to discuss? We have a few minutes remaining, time for one or two questions. Oh my. Well.
One in the back, Bill. Send a mic to you.
Thank you.
Good.
So you've rightly mentioned that it's a village. In fact, it's 8,000 odd plus banks. So where do you see the role of SWIFT in this, in helping bring us together on that?
I'm sorry, volume was not...
Sorry.
I apologize.
That's okay. Given that there's over 8,000 banks in our community for this, where do you think the role is for SWIFT for helping us bringing us together in sorting some of these problems out?
Thoughts?
So my first thought is SWIFT is a community. Leverage that community, right? So there has to be a way to interchange information about these hazards that are occurring, the things that are happening. Groups like the FSISAC have been very productive, but they don't reach all the nooks and crannies of the financial system. And so there are other communities that need to come to bear, whether they're in the payments infrastructure or in securities exchanges or in asset managers. And so multiple communities that overlap and intersect make this whole process better.
SWIFT is also a very credible standards organization from our perspective, and to the extent that there are gray areas in this landscape where SWIFT can shine light and produce standards that help us, whether it's processes for recovery, using SWIFT formats as standards for some sorts of things. But I think that SWIFT's role as a standards organization is clearly something to be leveraged here as well.
I think Swift can do at least two things more. One, I think Swift is generally seen as a rather professional organization in this area, so it can also set standards for financial market infrastructures, standards in terms of good practice, because they are, let's say, the critical service provider for many institutions. And critical service providers need to have at least the same level of protection as your own firm. The second thing I think Swift can do and does actually is to think with companies to provide solutions. For instance, in the example that I mentioned, if you cannot recover in your primary system, can you recover in another system? And Swift can help there as well.
Sir, that microphone on the way.
Thank you very much. The question about the resources. We saw in the outcome that generously spending resources is very low rated. How much is cyber resilience worth? How much are we able to spend and how much are we willing to spend?
So I think there's two pieces to that puzzle, right? So one, we mentioned fraud earlier. You know, we all have programs in place to make investments to manage fraud to within the number of basis points of transactions that's comfortable. And that deals with the criminal threat. I think the challenge is how do you deal with some of these systemic interconnectivity risk issues, like the destructive attacks against infrastructures. And I think that's one that's very hard to price. And so what many of us are doing is we're investing in advance of that problem showing up on our doorstep. And the question with no real answer is, are we doing enough fast enough? I mean, we can always spend more money, but it's kind of a problem I described. It'll happen somewhere between 3 seconds from now and 30 years from now. So where on the curve are we? And it's very hard to tell. So there's no perfect answer to that question.
But at a tactical level, a security roadmap is of course highly desirable. My firm plans 5 years in advance, which 2 years is good. The last 3 years probably not so helpful. But in terms of my CFO has long since given up the thought that I'm going to grow slower than any other unit that he has to approve. And in fact, because this is an essential brand attribute for every single one of our organizations, this is not an area for economy. And it is a matter of educating, although it again appears that our executive and board ranks are relatively mature in their approach to this, but it's a matter of constant education, bombardment, in fact, with information about the threat and developing a trusted relationship. I think where and how an organization deals with this challenge within its hierarchy is important. If this isn't a role that reports to the CEO, it's probably not as visible as it should be. In the old days, information security was very often a department within the CIO's organization, but contemporary risk management is not a CIO function, or I will assert that it's not. That there's a legal dimension to it, there's a regulatory management dimension to it, there's a client dimension to it, a client contracting dimension. All of this is very different than that traditional, that 15 years ago focus on security as an IT function. And so a fulsome security roadmap that's looking at the security dimensions of all those activities I've just mentioned is the way you make the case to your CFO, to your CEO, and to your board that this is an area of investment as opposed to an area simply of debt expense.
And increasingly we see organisations quarantining the cyber security, cyber risk bucket away from IT buckets and other ones that might get compressed with annual review cycles, and saying basically this is a cost of doing business. To the same point, this is an entrenched investment that we have to make every year, and if anything will likely go up rather than go down.
Yeah, and it's also, I think I very much agree to what you said, Murray, that it's not just like earlier, just an IT issue, what you also mentioned, but awareness is of very high importance. This is one of the topics, for instance, that the CPMI IOSCO report, which will probably come out next month about with the guidance for what financial market infrastructure should do in terms of cyber resilience, that awareness should be high on the agenda, because it was earlier in the polls, it scored very well.
Yes.
I hope that's true, but I'm not convinced. Maybe it's true, the score was high because we are all interested in, but it's as important that people who are not so much involved have a high level of awareness in an organization.
Indeed. So we are the first generation of bankers to deal with this threat category. My father didn't have to worry about this at all. He didn't even know how to turn on a computer, actually. But we are that first generation to deal with this threat. And as the panel has made perfectly clear, it's an existential threat if we don't get it right. That if financial stability is eroded, if customer confidence is eroded, if the integrity of our channels for payments and securities trading and settlement cannot be fully trusted, then our industry becomes something different and something less than it has always been throughout civilization. So thank you very much for your interest in this, what we consider to be an existential issue. Thank you for joining us this morning and listening to our somewhat organized thoughts on the matter. And wish you a great Sabas. What a terrific, terrific conference and a wonderful city. So, thank you.